In part 2 of chapter 8, we are going to continue looking at corrections. And as you recall, in part 1, we left off with corporal punishment, and we'll begin here with capital punishment. I'm using the material that's in your textbook, which comes from 2010. Amnesty International and Death Penalty Information Center being the two primary sources. But I wanted to bring to your attention the ease with which you can update information. And this could be particularly helpful, for example, if you are thinking about this as a topic for your term paper. Amnesty International's reports come out annually, and you could just do a search for Amnesty International Death Penalty, and you could get to this type of a page. Their 2013 report is identifies those countries where the death penalty is still being used. This particular item reminds us that China, well, it doesn't remind us so much, but as it mentioned in your textbook, China isn't identified in the statistics by Amnesty International any longer because it's a state secret when persons are executed, and Amnesty International and most other organizations who track things like this don't believe that the data they get is sound enough to even make estimates. They know that China executes thousands and thousands of people each year, but they just don't have a good estimate. So you won't find China being identified as being, in terms of statistics. They feel much better, Amnesty does, about Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States, in terms of the number of persons executed. And as they point out, the majority of executions were in Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia in 2013. The United States executing 39 individuals during that time period. But you'll also see that the vast majority of executions that occurred in 2013 occurred in these 3 or 4 countries, and then 5 if you included Somalia. But that gives you an idea anyway of the breakdown that they identify by Amnesty, and the information, the way they go about tracking and stuff is also interesting. So if it's a topic that's of interest to you, I encourage you to take a look at the 2013 data for more recent information. We're going to be looking primarily at the data that's in your textbook just to make testing easier. So according to Amnesty International, when you exclude China, there were more than 520 executions that were carried out in 2010, and that was over 23 different countries. I already explained that China just doesn't get included here. More than 80% of all the known executions in 2010, outside of China anyway, took place in Iran, North Korea, Yemen, and the United States. As we just saw, 2013 data has a few other countries except for Iran that are identified. More than 2/3 of the world's countries have actually abolished the death penalty in either law or practice. And it's interesting to take a look at who those abolitionist and retentionist countries are. The retentionist countries, which still number 58 in 2013, included Afghanistan, China, Cuba, and others that you see listed there. It's interesting that the United States is still amongst those who are retentionist countries, a source that confuses much of the rest of the Western world as to why the United States continues to use the death penalty. We have our own guesses. You ask academicians and journalists and media reports and the man and woman on the street as to why the United States still has the death penalty, and you'll get a variety of answers. But when the question is posed in terms of the other countries of the world that still retain the death penalty as opposed to those that have abolished it, it's sometimes difficult for individuals to see the link between the United States and the culture of these other countries that we happen to be grouped with. It does make for an interesting kind of conversation and debates as well regarding our continued use in the United States of the death penalty. From the 2013 report, I just added this little addition. Again, your textbook is the primary source in terms of text questions, however. Only 9 countries have continuously executed individuals over the last 5 years, and as you see, the United States is one of those 9 countries. Public opinion on the death penalty is, of course, one of the reasons why the United States continues to have the death penalty. It is popular. It's less popular than it was 10, 15 years ago in terms of the public opinion shows anyway, but it's still something that the American public tends to believe is an appropriate response for some types of crimes. One of the reasons the death penalty hasn't been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court may not believe that it violates standards of decency, which is one of the criteria used, not the only one certainly, but one of the criteria used by the Supreme Court in making decisions about whether any penalty is cruel and unusual. The Supreme Court has consistently taken into consideration public opinion as well as expert opinion and some others in terms of whether or not something should be identified under contemporary standards as cruel and unusual. And thus far, the public opinion polls would support a continuation, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned anyway, of the death penalty as it not being seen as cruel and unusual, at least by the general public. It's also important to note that even in countries where the death penalty has been abolished, it is not at all unusual for the penalty to be abolished regardless of public opinion. For example, as you probably know, any country wishing to belong to the European Union cannot have the death penalty. And so some of the countries in the European Union, even today, you could do a public opinion poll and you could find that many, maybe even the majority of people support the use of the death penalty, but the country itself does not have it because they could not be in the European Union and have it. So it's more of a political decision than a public opinion decision. Looking at some of the non-custodial sanctions, the most popular one, and the one that most people are familiar with, is probation. Probation is found throughout the world. It has rather standard kinds of goals, that is to reintegrate the individual offender into the community, into society, and in doing so make them not only be responsible for their actions, but also be returned to society as a productive, law-abiding member. One of the ways that they go about doing this is to have rather standard responsibilities by probation officers in countries around the world. So probation, no matter where it is existing, tends to provide information to other criminal justice agencies. We might think of the pre-sentence investigation report in the United States, for example, which can be used by a variety of agencies, not just probation, but also police departments and prisons. Probation officers also, no matter where they might be found, engage in case supervision. They assist individuals in getting reintegrated into society, and they monitor those individuals as well to make sure they are abiding by the terms and conditions of probation. And again, wherever probation is found, the probation officers typically have enforcement responsibilities. That is, they initiate revocation of probation if they have, in their monitoring, found somebody to have violated the terms and conditions. So we find that probation exists in a widespread manner, and it's pretty much typically carried out wherever it is found. Not too much variation there. Custodial sanctions, we also don't expect to find too much difference in the way that custodial sanctions are carried out. It's pretty much going to be prisons and jails, for example. One of the interesting sources of information here is the World Prison Brief, which I wanted to bring to your attention, especially because it could be helpful in carrying out some of your term papers, for example. This is a site that is at, as you may or may not be able to read here, www.prisonstudies.org. And then just from that place you could find World Prison Brief, or you could also just put into a search engine World Prison Brief and probably end up at the same place. But it is a very good place to get information about prisons and custodial sanctions in countries around the world. And you could break it down by individual region. You could look within those regions at individual countries. And I'm thinking in terms of the term paper that you're going to be writing, depending upon which countries you are interested in comparing. If corrections happens to be one of the topics that you're going to be looking at, I would strongly encourage you to use the World Prison Brief to gather information about, well, let's just pick Nigeria here. And as you go specifically to Nigeria, as you'll see in a few moments, you'll get individual information about the prison population rate, for example, the number of pretrial detainees that they have, prison females percentages, and so on. So a very useful report that I would encourage you to take a look at as you are preparing your papers, if corrections happens to be one of the topics you're going to be using in your paper. You could, if you wanted to, also use it as just as you're describing your individual country as a basic paragraph description of their correction system as well. About half the world's prison population is in just 3 countries. The textbook notes that the United States has the highest imprisonment rate in the world, at that time 749 when the book was published. Just as an update, but again, for test purposes, we will be using the information in the textbook. But for your own information, currently the United States has an imprisonment rate of 707 per 100,000 population. I'm sorry, per 1,000 population. And this now makes us second to the Seychelles in terms of the number of prisoners per population in the world. The textbook covers custodial sanctions in 3 countries, South Africa, Brazil, and India, and overcrowding is the common problem found in each of those countries. Just as a brief overview of what you'll find in your textbook as well, you'll see that overcrowding exists in all 3 of those countries, and in fact overcrowding is a problem in many other countries around the world. Less so in the United States today than it has been in the past, depending on which state you happen to be talking about. But you can see that the prison capacity in South Africa, Brazil, and India, the prisons operate over capacity in each of those countries. Looking at South Africa, most of the prisons there are for males, but there are a few that are co-ed or have women only. There are also a few youth facilities. Pretrial detainees are in detention an average of 6 months, and it's important to point out that when you're looking at countries other than the United States, if you are awaiting trial in the United States, you're probably going to be in a jail, a facility run by city or county governments. But in most countries of the world, if you are awaiting trial, in all likelihood you're going to be held in a prison, a separate section of the prison, but in the prison itself, the same place where you would end up if you received a prison sentence. You would just be sent to a different section within that prison. This means that it's a little bit difficult sometimes to get a count of how many persons are in prison in different countries around the world, because most other countries are including their pretrial detention individuals. That's why in the United States, when we do comparison statistics, we typically include our jail and prison population whenever we are comparing the prison rate in the United States to the imprisonment rate for other countries. Most of the problems that exist in South African prisons are linked to those overcrowded conditions. Brazil, similar kind of situation. Police lockups, which would be their version of our jails, hold about 25% of the prison population. In some states, the convicted prisoners will serve their entire sentence in these prison lockups simply because it isn't possible to move them into full-fledged prisons. Again, most of the problems that Brazil encounters are linked to those overcrowded conditions, as we'll see is true in India as well. Prison populations here are also mostly pretrial detainees, and it wouldn't be unusual for somebody to stay longer in a pretrial situation than what the actual penalty would have been had their case been heard earlier and they received a a prison sentence for whatever crime they were brought in for. So these are the kinds of situations and problems that exist in the way that custodial sanctions are carried out in countries around the world. Women in prison presents an interesting dilemma for many countries. There are really more similarities in the way that prisons, or that women are handled in prisons, than there are differences in the way that they are treated around the world. And those similarities are linked to these three conditions. First of all, the small number of women prisoners there are in pretty much any country, the imprisonment of drug offenders, and the needs and problems that women prisoners present in difference to the needs and problems that they present for males in prison. Take a look at the small numbers just to give you an example, and this link is going to take us back to the World Prison Report that I mentioned a few slides earlier. And one of the things that we can find here is to look at different categories. And I'm just going to choose the female prisons as a percentage of the prison population. And we're going to use the entire world as opposed to breaking it down to individual categories. As you can see, you can do it by region, but we'll look at the entire world. And in doing that, we'll end up with a breakdown of the number, or the percentage of female prisoners in a particular country. So as you can see, Hong Kong has almost 20% of its prison population is female, compared with the United States, for example, with about 9%. And going down to, pick one here, Paraguay, about 7%. We get down to Sweden, where around 6% of the population is female, and jumping down to Egypt with maybe 4%. And it goes down to some countries where there aren't any, or at least not enough to even count as 0.1% of those where a count is possible. Zambia, Grenada, Libya, around 1%. So it's interesting to think about what some of the differences might be. And again, I'm mentioning this primarily for term paper purposes. If you are interested in the corrections area, one of those areas of interest might be female prisoners. And by comparing the number of, the percentage of female prisoners in the three countries you're dealing with, might provide an interesting little section for your paper. The next slide talks about foreign prisoners, and even though I'm just going to not leave this this area, just to go back to the slides to come back here anyway. So let me just use that drop down. Oops, I did female again, sorry. We're going to choose foreign prisoners here in the entire world, and we're going to do a breakdown of what percentage of the prison population in different countries happens to be foreign prisoners. This is the primary way we have to do it because so many countries don't keep track of prisoners by ethnicity or race. So it's a lot easier to just track the number of foreign prisoners that there are. And this gives us an idea of minority populations in many prisons. You'll see that Monaco has an extremely high proportion of foreign prisoners, but part of this is because Monaco itself has such a small population, just population of those people who actually are citizens of Monaco. But some of these others, Saudi Arabia, for example, with over 70% of its persons in its prison population being foreigners, in Saudi Arabia and many other Middle Eastern countries, you have foreigners coming in to work in the Saudi Arabian oil fields, for example, and those individuals end up receiving, are discriminated against, as are many minorities. So the point here is that minorities end up being in prison, not just in the United States, for example, but in all countries around the world. The prison population is oftentimes linked to minority status. As you can see here, we have about 7% foreign prisoners. We do track in the United States the number of minorities, so you could find out how many Hispanics for ethnicity. If you're doing race, you could find out how many black prisoners we have. But again, that's not really possible to do in other countries. So foreign prisoners are used instead. So let's go back to this area and continue with our women in prison. Imprisoning drug offenders is another reason why there is similarity amongst the way that women are handled in different countries around the world in the prisons. The United States began a very tough sentencing program and that for drug offenders, and that ended up affecting the number of women in prison because of the way that women are used as mules, as drug carriers, for example, and ending up having an increased percentage of women in our U.S. prisons. And also, as I said, the specific needs that women present in prison, including the mother-child relationship and having mothers in prison. Your textbook again points out that in some countries it's possible for the mother to have the child with her in prison up to the child's certain age. That is less likely to occur in the United States, and also makes for an interesting term paper topic. That is, how are pregnant women in prison and new mothers in prison handled in different countries around the world, and comparing countries on that basis makes for some interesting comparisons as well. Your textbook includes some ways that, or some suggestions for ways that countries can change the way that women are handled in prison. I won't read through those, you can find them in your textbook as well. But there are concerns about maintaining mother-child relationships, vocational opportunities for women that are different than those for men just because of the different occupations that women end up going into. But many prisons are built around, understandably so, because of the high numbers of male prisoners, and they then provide only educational and vocational opportunities geared toward those male offenders, leaving female offenders out of training that might allow them to get a job after their release. So take a look at some of those recommendations. And then the last section here is on racial and ethnic minorities. I already showed you the link about the disproportionate representation of foreign prisoners in different countries around the world. This is not simply a U.S. problem in terms of racial and ethnic minorities, but it is something that countries around the world are experiencing problems with their minority population, and explanations for why there might be such a high proportion. The last two items here indicate some of those suggestions that have been offered as to why there is a disproportionate representation. It might be the result of selective criminalization practices and or selective prosecution. It could also be simply that the poor social and economic status that foreigners and ethnic minorities have in any country leads to more crime by those groups, and that's why they end up having a greater representation in prison. This obviously also makes for an interesting point of comparison if you were to consider that as being a topic for your term paper. So the chapter ends then, or at least this PowerPoint presentation ends, with some suggestions for ways that you might incorporate some of these topics into your term paper. Comparing countries on the basis of how they use financial penalties, taking a look at how capital punishment is used differently or not used at all in countries of your choice, types of non-custodial sanctions in addition to probation. Maybe you can find different ways that your countries are using non-custodial sanctions. And as I've said most recently, comparing the way that women and other minorities end up being responded to in a custodial manner, and what prison for women and prison for minorities looks like in different countries. So that completes Chapter 8. Thank you again for your attention.